Stanley's movies don't age. You look at them and you still find things in them. Every time you go to look at it, whatever point, it's like a great novel. Wherever you are in your life, it means something different.
He was one of the great storytellers of all time, and he used film as his medium to do that, and it was beautiful.
It's not a violent scene. It's the most violent scene. It's not an angry scene. It's the most angry scene. It's not a sergeant berating his troops. It's a sergeant berating until it's operatic. It's not a helicopter shot. It's the biggest, widest, smoothest helicopter shot possible of the car in The Shining. So he was sort of incapable of working without pushing at the edges.
And they all went back to America, but we stayed because we wanted our children to keep going to school here, and they were English by then. And we felt at home here.
We've had a wonderful childhood, totally special, but at the same time it's been completely anonymous. Nobody knows our faces until now. Nobody knew Dad's face. He had the best of being famous, is that he was terribly famous and yet he was completely anonymous. I would say that considering that he could go into M&S and St Albans and nobody would bother him, I think that was wonderful.
Stanley very sensibly divested himself of the behaviour of fame. And the result of that was, ironically but not unpredictably, to render his doppelganger the mad recluse of St Albans.
The definition of recluse in the press is that he didn't speak to them. He spoke to everyone else. I mean, it's just not true.
It's a very strange position to be in, having to defend how you live and having to explain that your father was not this weird person. He was unusual, yes. He was maybe even eccentric in some areas, but I'm sure we all have eccentricities. And if you take the fact that he didn't care much about clothes and how he looked, his life was in his head and his imagination and his work.
He didn't consider it retreating. His home was where not only he and his family lived. His wife was an artist, so she worked there at home. He worked at home. His editing rooms were at home. His projection rooms were at home. He did most of his pre and all of his post-production at home. So his home was not just a place to raise the family, who he was very close with, and to have friends come by, which was always the case, but his home was where it all revolved around.
The parts of the house that were dedicated to his work, which were probably all of it, did revolve around him. And there were people constantly doing things that seemed to me very mysterious, but were clearly to do with how takings were going in Bangkok or whatever it was. I'm not sure that the kitchen didn't revolve around the dogs. Undoubtedly, one felt the ubiquity of his wife. So I think that there's a balanced double heart of that enormous setup.
When I first went there, I was actually depressed because there were these beautiful, large, bright canvases signed Kubrick. And I thought, oh, God, he's a master artist as well. But then I found that these were his wife's paintings. She just signed them Kubrick. And occasionally, if we were stumped, Stanley would light a ciggy and he'd say, how about a bit of fresh air, Brian? Okay. So he'd open a door onto his rolling acres and take 10 paces out, Stanley puffing very heavily, and there Mrs. Kubrick would be sitting, painting at her easel. We'd talk to her and be relaxed, and he'd say, that's about enough. And we'd go in again and start the day's work.
I envy Stanley for all those years he worked at home, with an eye shot of his kids growing up and his pets and his wife and her art and her tremendous talent, Christiana's, and all of his colleagues. I mean, I love working out of the house, and I understand why Stanley loved working out of the house too, because his films are personal. His life is personal. Everything about him is personal, and being at home and not being in an office, is a whole different way of getting close to that zeitgeist.
Well, I met Stanley through the telephone, and for several years we spoke regularly on the phone. And at one point I said, Stanley, we should meet up and have dinner. And he said, why? He said, we have a perfectly good telephonic relationship. Why should we meet? And it was a typical kind of question that Stanley would ask, and you couldn't really think of an answer, except he always put you on the back foot like that.
That's what used to kill me when I talked to him on the phone. I didn't believe he lived in England. He never lost his Brooklyn accent. He talked like a Brooklyn kid. He was a Brooklyn street kid, period.
And we talked like a broken record. I mean, we were on the telephone for 18 years. And there's whatever we could, not that often, unfortunately, but whenever we could, I would see him in London. And he picked my brain for those 18 years, and I picked his.
And he was constantly looking for information, and about filmmaking. I mean, he was obsessed with every aspect of it. I mean, he loved films. I mean, and he was extremely generous. If he liked one of my films, he would be on the phone right away saying how much he admired it and how did you do that shot.
On Full Metal Jacket, he had every take on a different television screen with a different computer tower, with different tape unit, different 3/4-inch feed. And he would compare take 1 to take 31 with all these monitors and all these 3/4-inch tape machines. And during Full Metal Jacket, when we talked, he would just rave about how easy it is to compare a performance, to compare Lee Ermey's performance on take 5 and then take 25, because he had the monitors right next to each other.
Total gadget freak, I think he was.
I kind of supplied him with a lot of toys.
Had to be the latest, the newest.
Sort of the toys of our trade were all over Stanley's kitchen, in his workspace.
The most wonderful, there's a better one coming out.
Flat tins of film, like great big metal pills.
Total sucker for that.
Machines which were completely arcane.
He felt silly being like that sometimes.
We might as well have been in a rocket.
But he couldn't resist it. This was absolute his candy.
I wonder if he was really worried about overload. That he was so keen to take stuff in that if he didn't in some way reduce the amount of input, it might have driven him crazy. Because he didn't have any of the obvious symptoms of the paranoidly deranged. I mean, it's clear that he had a long and, in biblical terms, fruitful marriage, that he got on with his extended family, many of whom worked for him, that people, including Emilio, came back and back to work for him who didn't have to, that he did have friends and contacts all over the place. So it wasn't a kind of world-hating kind of reclusivity. It was almost as though he had quite enough coming in as it was, and that if he didn't control that in some way, either he would waste all his time or he would just be driven, balmy by overload. He was running too many programs at the same time.
Everybody then read more science fiction, I think, than people do now. I read it all the time. I read all Arthur Clarke, and I was complete science fiction mad. And Stanley, more so even. Both constantly having, exchanging books. And then Arthur came on the scene, and it was like an explosion of information and exciting stories. It was all this short story of his then grew and grew and grew into this enormous project.
One of the most dramatic moments in my life is, and I'll never forget, it was 2001 when I was on my father's shoulders, because it was just sold out in this biggest theater I'd ever been to in my life, and it was my sister's birthday, my little sister's birthday, and they took us to see 2001: A Space Odyssey, the whole family. And movies were kind of a big deal in our family, and I sat on my father's shoulders through this picture. And even at 7, you don't comprehend, but even then it had this impact on my life. I found myself lying in the front in the yard at night in the snow and looking up at the stars and thinking, what am I going to do with my life? What is it about? What is going on? Why am I here?
It was really a hand-knitted film. No computer work at all, and guessing what the world would look like. He didn't know. Nobody knew. I hadn't seen it yet. It was pretty close to the way it then did look. Not blue enough, but pretty close.
He took you into space for the first time. I mean, since 2001, no documentary, no other movie, no IMAX experience being on the shuttle and looking down at Earth has ever really put me in space as much as 2001 did. I mean, my God, that was maybe, for me, his most realistic movie that he had ever made. And I think his second most realistic movie that he ever made for me was Clockwork Orange, where it was like reading the newspaper today.
Stanley was very insulted by the reaction and hurt. And then the reason the film was withdrawn was because we got so many threats that the police said we really must do something. And he withdrew it, both artistically hurt as also scared. He didn't want to be misunderstood and misinterpreted, and you also don't like to get death threats for your family and everybody. They were very serious. Very serious.
It was literally frightening because you felt these people around the house, and suddenly we weren't allowed to go in the front yard unless we had to, and driven to school, and it all got quite hard.
It's difficult to believe, looking here at this exquisite privacy, that you felt that your lives were somehow in danger.
It was. That's not paranoia. Was on paper. Many times over, we got very strange threats from groups as well as individuals. And someone sent a brown paper bag with a sculpture of Clockwork Orange in it, ticking. That was a fan. It was uncomfortable. It's difficult for the children, and we wanted to stay in England. And so, don't show the film.
I'm sorry, but we don't usually let strangers in.
Was that the withdrawal of the film successful in stopping those threats?
Yeah, at once. It was.
That request of Stanley's went on for many years. At the beginning, it was not a contractual request. In fact, indeed, it never really was. It was kind of, if you want to keep me safe and healthy and comfortable, don't do it.
When he read over and over how few films he made, he would be very depressed. He said, yes, I wait always too long in between because I want to get it right. And that depressed him. Yes, made him sad that he couldn't find the story quicker.
I think Stanley was always had great problems in finding material that he wanted to do. I mean, I think that he spent a lot of time on films he didn't make, as we all do, of course. But in particular, I think he wanted to make a film about artificial intelligence, and he struggled to do that for a long, long time.
He did find a short story of mine, which had appeared originally in Harper's Bazaar in 1969, I think. Super Toys last all summer long. And for some reason, Stanley got really hooked on this little story. And so we talked about this, and Stanley eventually said, I can't think why I can't quite get to grips with this story. I think I would think more creatively if I could buy it from you. Well, actually, Naive is my middle name. I didn't really want to send it to him. But eventually I did. Wiser counsels prevailed, as they say. And so he took this story over, and then he said, well, let's work on it together and make it into a movie.
We who were involved in the AI project really thought that it was Stanley's primary ambition was to make this particular very ambitious science fiction epic about robot intelligence.
He said to me once, how can I make a movie that would gross as much as Star Wars and yet allow me to retain my reputation for social responsibility? Again, it's actually a funny line. It's a Kubrick line. He's not serious, he's not joking, he's a bit of both.
It was rather like piling up a castle of bricks, the story, and usually at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Stanley would discover some tiny hairline loophole in the plot, which he would immediately widen into a giant crevasse. Then the castle of bricks was kicked right over. I would be filled with despair, try to put it back together again.
He had a contempt for narrative. I was kind of hooked on narrative. But he said to me, forget it. All you need for a movie is 6 or 8 non-submersible units. This was his phrase, non-submersible units. And once you've heard this, you see how 2001 is constructed of non-submersible units. And I thought that was very, very impressive. So I also scrapped narrative. And we had got, I believe, 3 non-submersible units. But at this point, enter Pinocchio. Oh God, Pinocchio and the Blue Fairy. I've wanted Stanley to create a great modern myth.
Collaborators were supposed to come up with something different and unexpected, preferably every day.
I couldn't get my mind around this.
Normally you start writing a story or a book and you continue it for a while, but this was like starting to write a complete new short story every morning and then tearing it up in the evening.
We agreed to part, and Stanley then lit another cigarette and turned his back on me, and that was it.
Ian Watson did an almost full novel-length treatment, which I've never seen. And when he'd finished it, Stanley said to him, I need somebody to smear this with vaginal gel. And I have to say, when I first heard that, I was rather shocked because he never would have used, he was very gentlemanly at one level. He would never have used language. But I think I was the vaginal gel.
It never felt as though we were man and a woman. It's like when you're having a properly satisfactory conversation. You aren't driven by your gender. You're simply minds dancing.
But I think one of the reasons why he wanted to work with a woman, which he didn't usually do, was because he felt, as I said, that the science fiction had come to dominate the plot too much. But perhaps even more importantly, that there was something lacking, some level of kind of humanity lacking in some of his later work.
A very great deal of time was spent, as it were, skirting round some phenomenon that one didn't know what it was, as though there was something very important in the room, let's say an elephant under a cloth, but one wasn't allowed to tweak the cloth, one had to guess what was the thing under the cloth.
Collaborators tend to get a bit unhappy when suddenly Stanley either decides that they're not performing properly or their particular role has come to an end. Stanley has focused upon them so much, and not in an artificial way, but in a totally genuine, full rapport way, that when there's stops, they feel as though they have been abandoned, thrown out into the street.
he was absolutely unaware of the normal frustrations of middle-class, not particularly rich life. You know, computers did not break down. Why hadn't I got it fixed? Why didn't I have a competent fixer? Why hadn't I sent for them already? Why was my printer not working? You know, so that I wanted it at 10 o'clock. I wanted it there when I woke up, he said to me once. I wanted it there when I woke up. And I said, well, yeah. But it wasn't. It wasn't because I hadn't done it or because I was lazy.
Well, whether it was Sarah Maitland or Ian Watson, he wanted a different brain to add to his. He was incredibly smart and very inventive, but you know, he didn't think he knew everything or had all the ideas, so he was very appreciative of other people's good ideas.
He got the plumber in, actually. You know, the writers, and I suspect other people who wrote for him, were the plumber. And I think that's why a lot of people ended up being very hurt, actually, by him.
He was a general, and his army, and generals have that tendency to be dictatorial.
You know, there were real conflicts. And I think there were conflicts in the way he worked, too. That he appeared to have enormous respect and enthusiasm for different people's work, but then he actually didn't want their work. He only wanted his work. I didn't deliver for him. I felt that it wasn't working out at lots of levels, and I feel that that was actually more his fault than mine. I think I could have done it.
People have said, well, you know what he's like. Why did you go and work with him? Well, I went to work with him because he was Stanley Kubrick. That was the answer.
He was preparing AI for quite some time, as he was Eyes Wide Shut. And he was determined after the screenplay that collectively we did not go forward on, which was really his choice. He decided to be having more than one choice the next time. So he took that extra year or two and was working on 2 projects at the same time. One was Eyes Wide Shut, and the other was AI.
He said in more than one case, I think the ideal director for this would be Steven Spielberg. If I do it, it may be too stark. I may emphasize too much the philosophical side.
He told me I couldn't show the storyboards to anyone. I couldn't tell anyone what the story was about. And I didn't. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't tell anyone. And I mean anyone. And it was at that time that he said, I got an idea. Why don't I produce it? You can direct it.
And I saw dollar bills in front of my eyes. I saw Stanley Kubrick directing Eyes Wide Shut, and somewhere simultaneously or shortly thereafter, Steven Spielberg directing the Stanley Kubrick movie AI.
He didn't say, it has to be this way. He'd say, what would you do? And then he'd say, here's what I would do. What if we took this piece of your idea and this piece of my idea? I mean, he was amazingly collaborative.
It needs a brilliant director. Otherwise, it doesn't work at all. Yeah, but yeah, if you have somebody like Steven Spielberg, I mean, this could fly. This could be the most amazing story.
You're asking what it was in Stanley that gave him that authority, and I would just say that he had it like a divine, like he had it because he didn't work in an area where he felt he knew less than anybody else. He worked where he felt he knew more. He could come in the set after lunch and say, who's messed with the light? And Larry, the cameraman, would say, nobody's messed with the light, Stanley. Yeah, it's not the same. It's not the same. And Larry would go to each electrician. There are 4 electricians. Say, is your dimmer in the same place? Yes, on the same place. Is your dimmer? Yes. Yes, your dimmer? Yeah. Stan would say, get the meter out. Get the meter out. And it was an 1/8 of a stop different or something. But he just had, he could tell it.
Every film he's ever made, the craft is impeccable. The dolly shots, the crane moves, the zooms on Barry Lyndon, the framing, the lighting, the hot windows as backlight. You know, there's the compositions. I mean, the exact compositions. You had to hit your mark precisely to please Stanley so he'd get his painting, the painting he was putting on canvas for you to appreciate. It had to be perfect. His choice of lenses, his Steadicam work in latter year films, impeccable, the best in history.
His method was to come onto a set, which of course he had carefully planned, and look at it. And it wasn't until he saw it that he knew what he could do with it.
The thing that I've learned from Stanley technically is how to shoot things in masters. How to trust the audience to be the film editor sometimes, and how to trust the audience to decide who they want to look at and when.
you can look at Stanley's films and say, there's a cool theatricality here that I admire but don't particularly respond to emotionally. Now, if you're saying in order to do that, was there some spontaneity that got missed? Perhaps. I don't know. But in Stanley's opinion, and most of the world's, the trade-off was more valuable. That what he got by creating this architecture in a very studied way was preferable to the slightly more spontaneous, closer to reality behavior, let's say, that you see in most other movies.
He invited me over to see the soundstage that he was about to shoot The Shining on, and the soundstage I was about to build my main set from Raiders of the Lost Ark on. I saw a model of the set that I was on in the middle of the set. It was a very small model, a tabletop model, and I saw this man in rumpled clothes and a kind of a long open sweater and baggy pants and kind of work shoes, scuffing around with a, I guess you could call it a periscope of sorts. He looked in one end and the tip of this metal tip goes onto the set, and he had a Nikon screwed into the eyepiece, and he was sort of taking pictures of this model. He took me on a tour up through all the corridors through this eyepiece. He said, look through the camera and I'll guide the eyepiece. And he literally guided me on a tour, which if you wanted a jump cut ahead in time, it was the same shot behind Danny on his tricycle. And he was very, very proud of the model, but I wondered, why is he showing me a model when the set is already finished? It was all up there. You could still smell the paint drying. I used to send Stanley all of my films before I even showed him in the studio. I'd have somebody take the print to London. Stanley was his own projectionist, so he'd thread it up himself and he'd run the picture. We'd talk about the picture. And the only time in knowing Stanley that I had a chance to ask Stanley for that favor in return was Full Metal Jacket. And I asked Stanley, I said, Stanley, can I see Full Metal Jacket early? He said, well, wait to see it in the theater. It'd be better with an audience, see it with an audience. I said, well, Stanley, can I just look at it, before it comes out? And he said, gee, I'd rather you didn't. He was very nice about saying no. And then I said, well, Stanley, how is it that you've seen 3 of my pictures in the last 5-6 years, and I haven't seen any of yours early, but I show you all mine early? He says, well, that's because I'm me and you're you.
I read the script and flew immediately to where he was, to his property, and I landed on his property in this helicopter. And I said, look, I'm sorry about this, but otherwise it's a 6-hour drive, and I've got, my babies are here, and Nick, and I couldn't figure out another way how to get there quickly and then get back. And of course, he'd set up the landing pad, and I remember the helicopter coming in onto his property, and he'd given me the GPS coordinates to give to the pilot, and sent me a diagram of where he wanted me to land the airplane, the helicopter. And I remember just landing in, and there he was, just waiting, just alone in the garden as it came down. And the helicopter came down, and we discussed the helicopter and what kind it was and how many hours that I'd flown in these helicopters. And he walked me around the grounds, and I just remember thinking, this guy's kind of a magical, wonderful guy.
He wanted to make this film at one point in his life. I don't know, with his age.
No.
Oh. I mean, the film is about the mind, jealousy and sexual obsession of the mind. It has nothing to do with, it's not at all pornographic or anything like that, not a bit. Quite the opposite.
So we discussed the script, and he wanted to know what, I can't even remember what I said about it, just different story points of did I understand this, and was I confused about anything. But he first allowed me to talk. He didn't, probe, really. And then I took off in the helicopter, and it was over too quickly for me. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a real adventure. This is going to be a great adventure of my life.
He wanted me to guess by whom it was, and about 2 days in, I did, but I didn't want to sort of spoil the fun. So we did a little bit of speculation.
To make a film about that seemed so unattractive to me that whenever he brought it up, I said, I hate that book, get it, put it away. And he was particularly angry that I hated it and said, why? I would like to know why you hate that book so much. So it's one of those conversations.
The story at that point was very clearly about the mutual manipulation of jealousy, which is torture. It's what we can do to one another in the most intimately painful way. And it's clearly quite obvious that if you're dealing with erotic entanglement, there is a compulsion to hurt that lies very close to intense involvement.
But the themes are universal when you look at jealousy, obsession, fantasies, sex. I mean, it's every individual understands this, and some people don't want to ever feel like they have fantasies or that it's the devil or it's bad. And I, right away when I read the script, you're thinking, okay, Nick and I are going to make this together. We could invest aspects of our own relationship into this and our own understanding into these characters. Even though Stanley would say, well, that's just an added bonus, that was definitely something that he counted on and wanted, but never abused that at all, ever, not once.
As an actor, you set up, there's reality and there's pretend, and those lines get crossed, and it happens when you're working with a director that allows that to happen. And it's a very exciting thing to happen. It's a very dangerous thing to happen.
In the acting scenes, he worked in a way I understood very well, which is a kind of feel your way through it as you go. You have the boundaries of the scene in your head, as he did. But then he sort of gives you a little push-off and sees where you go. And then he starts to correct it slowly, and then he records it on video with the tap. He wouldn't film it sometimes. He would record it on video. Then he would show it to us. I'd sit here, Tom would sit here. He would go through it, freeze the frame, and say, see that when you turned your head like that? He will change this. Or at the end of a take, he'd say, okay, Sidney, come here. I'd come and I'd sit down. He wouldn't say anything to Tom. Then he would go through it with me. Or, okay, Tom, come here. Let's watch this.
Stanley would say, look, we got to earn every scene with this character, every single moment with this character. And he knew that, in times when I just get frustrated with myself and that at times that we couldn't get it, you know what I mean? And it was just like, fuck. It just, or you just know when you don't have that fire burning that day, or if I was tired, it just, and I bring it upon myself, because I demand a lot of myself.
Stanley always was waiting for something to happen. He wasn't as interested in naturalistic acting as he was in something that, for whatever reason, surprised him or piqued his interest. That's when he would go, okay, now we're on to something.
He always would say, when we would talk about it, isn't it silly? The cheapest part of all this is do another take. Do another take. You've spent millions of dollars preparing and building sets, hiring people, doing costumes, and months and months writing a script, years sometimes. And then you get there and you quit on take 5, or take 6, or take 7. Isn't that silly? You don't know what's going to happen if you try 3 or 4 or 5 more.
He would say, okay, you've done a few takes, now you can just do what you want to do. And I'd heard all these stories about him being incredibly controlling and not wanting this and not wanting that. And at certain times he was very controlling. At other times he was, please just, and particularly with the monologues, is when he allowed me just to really just get lost in Alice. And I think that's what happened. I mean, over the course of the year and a half, I just, became that woman.
Millions of years of evolution. Right? Right?
Men have to stick it in every place they can, but for women it is just about security and commitment and whatever the fuck else.
A little oversimplified, Alice, but yes, something like that.
If you men only knew.
When he had this important scene with them, he had them in the set and he watched outside on a monitor and let them go through it over and over, and it was very raw stuff. It was very that's why I said they took more than their clothes off. They absolutely took their skin off. Women know that they have that power if they're loved. Only then do they have it to tease. I think it was a very good film for an older person to make with quite a lot of hindsight. And you become softer and more honest with yourself as you grow older. And I think that Stanley was much more pessimistic, much more cynical as a very young man. I think most of us become nicer when we're older, more, even more mellowed. And he certainly was more optimistic than I sometimes was. He would be able to talk me out of any depression very quickly. He was very positive and incredibly not judgmental. He's often spoken of as this very severe thing. I never experienced him. I mean, we had the usual household nonsense and quarrels over should the dog be fed this or not, trivia. But we didn't have serious rows. And I think the overriding feeling he gave his family and other people is how very entertaining Stanley was. I think he was I was the best entertained woman ever. And I think I was also the best loved one. So I feel very alone now.
The difficulties of accepting the reality of his death is it's very hard to feel that he isn't going to suddenly phone up. I've got it when I'm here. When I'm here, it's so different. The reminders of his not being here are so clear. I spent weeks practically the whole time since he died having to deal with issues and matters to do with him not being there. But when I'm home, life is, everything is the same. So it's really hard to accept that the phone isn't going to ring or he's going to fax me. And I can't get rid of his fax number on, I have a computer with a phone book in it. And I can't bring myself to erase him. Just those things. It's so hard to believe he isn't on the end of a line somewhere.
For me, meal times were always amazing because it would consist of, what are you doing? How are the boys? Did you hear? Did you know some incredible juicy piece of gossip that he'd picked up? And how do you figure out such and such? And when he left, when the mealtime was over, you invariably had laughed, learned something, had to think about something more deeply than you might otherwise have done, thought, okay, I'll deal with that in the morning. And the other thing is that when you have a problem and you think, oh, I'll call Daddy and he can tell me, can't do that anymore.
I didn't believe it. And I didn't want to believe it because it just seemed wrong. Didn't seem like the right time. He seemed to have too many other things to do. and say. And it's still very, sorry.
Even when I went to the funeral, I was not in a good way, and I was very concerned about Nick and very concerned about Christian and his family, and concerned about the movie, because I know what it meant to him and what it meant to me, and my wife, my co-star, my love. And I still even went to the funeral thinking, somewhere it was, it was ridiculous, because somewhere still inside I thought, and Nick and I were talking, that it's not true. Somewhere deep inside I wanted to believe this is not true, that I'm going to go and I will show up at the house and he will be there.
At some time we talked about how horrible graveyards are, and so I decided he liked to sit over there all the time, so that's where we put his grave.